All right. Hopefully everyone can see that now. This is a picture of my father-in-law's, one of his soybean fields. This was probably taken a week ago, so you can get an idea of what at least some of the crops in this region look like. See, they're looking pretty healthy. That's actually his dairy out in the distance, right there. So he has a small dairy as well. So yeah, we're going to be talking today about the Brazilian crop and if they're on track for another record, as kind of originally estimated by the USDA. So I'll let you read through that quickly. Futures trading involves risk. Won't be giving any real trading advice, but if I did, there is no guarantee that the advice we give will result in profitable trades. So I took a trip the first week of December in a new region of Brazil that I have not been to before. It's in the southeast region of the state of Pará. The town there is called Santana da Araguaia. And it's kind of interesting because in this region, it's known for having a lot of gravel in its fields and different pockets of gravel. And so, it's not necessarily across the entire field, but there's enough of it that I think would be kind of annoying. But you look at these pictures here that, the stand still looks pretty good. And a lot of the locals say, it really doesn't affect production that much, that it's just kind of a thin layer of gravel over the top. But I think it probably burns through a lot of the discs or the coulters on the planters maybe a little faster than they otherwise would, but they still seem to be getting pretty good production. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting picture in this kind of a developmental region, something that we wouldn't be used to seeing very much in the Corn Belt in the United States. So I want to show you a quick video of one of the places that I stopped at. This is just a 2 or 3 minute video, and hopefully you can hear the volume here when I turn it up.
Bruce with Comstock. I am in the southeast region of the state of Pará, almost on the border of Tocantins in Mato Grosso. And this is my first time in this specific region. It's a relatively new region. There's a lot of land being developed. This particular field is the first year that soybeans have ever been planted. So last year, this was native vegetation. So that you're looking at a brand new field of soybeans. First time it's ever been planted. I think it was planted about 2 weeks ago. So I'm here with the agronomist on the farm, Eduardo. Obrigado. Você pode explicar pouco do trabalho aqui, como foi conduzido? I'm asking Eduardo to explain to us a little bit about the work that they've done here on this property.
Sim, Matheus, a gente começou essa empreitada com o pessoal, né, que arrendou essa propriedade aqui, né? E foi um trabalho que eles me contrataram para acompanhar os trabalhos deles, né? E a gente fez aqui todo um trabalho de preparação do solo, de limpeza da área. A gente fez uma adubação corretiva de calcário, né? 8 toneladas por hectare. Fizemos uma correção de fósforo na área, né? E tudo está se encaminhando para ter uma boa safra, se que a população que foi planejada está bem estabelecida.
He's just talking about a lot of the work that they've done to prepare for this year, that they've put on about 8 tons per hectare of lime. They've also put on close to 1 ton of phosphorus. And so they've done a lot of work to correct the soil fertility. The natural soil fertility is quite low. And so they're pretty happy with the seed population.
Essa variedade aqui é uma variedade própria para primeiro ano de plantio, né? Ela exige aí em torno de 260 mil plantas por hectare.
So they planted about 260,000 seeds per hectare. So you divide that by 2.5 to get your seeds per acre. So you're a little over 100,000. So is what that would be. And they chose this specific variety because it is for new areas that are weaker in soil fertility.
A nossa expectativa aqui, Matheus, é conseguir uma produção aí entre 55 a 60 sacas por hectare, né? Vamos falar aí, o quilo seria 3.000 a 3.600 quilos por hectare, nossa expectativa de produção com esse investimento que foi feito.
So with this high investment in fertility that they made, they're already expecting a yield of over 60 sacks per hectare. So that'd be roughly 54 bushels per acre is what their production goal on this field in its very first year.
So that's just gives you an idea of some new land that just got brought into production and that I want to go visit. So obviously today the markets are up, and a lot of it has to do with what's going on with the weather in Brazil. So I figured we'd start talking a little bit about the weather. This shows you the cooling ocean temperatures in the Pacific region. This is what gives us our La Nina effect, and what's created some of the weather patterns going on right now in Brazil. And so that's one of the first things that we look for is the temperature of waters in the Pacific Ocean here. You can see here by the blue that they're been quite a bit cooler. And so, you know, as long as that continues, of course, the longer that some of these drier tendencies in parts of Brazil will continue. When we get a La Nina, what does that mean in Brazil? And generally, it means that you're getting drier weather to the south and rainier weather, more precipitation to the north. And so far that's been the case this year. It was kind of the case last year. And so we're somewhat in a repeat situation, at least starting out for this year's crop. Now in El Nino, the opposite of that is true. You have wetter conditions in the south and drier conditions in the north. Looking at the 15-day forecast starting on December 20th, you can see, unfortunately, there's not much that changed. The narrative continues where we have dry weather taking place in the south, and particularly the epicenter is here. This is the state of Rio Grande do Sul. You have the state of Santa Catarina, the state of Paraná. Now, this is where most of the dryness has been limited to up until recently. But what I see a little bit different now in the next couple of weeks is that's actually the dry areas are expanding. Now they're expanding here into the state of São Paulo. This is the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. And they start to come into this tip of Goiás, which is actually this southern part of Goiás is where most of the really good grain producing areas are. Up here is a little bit more pasture, cattle area. It's a little bit rougher. But there's really good grain production areas here. And I'm located about right here. So I'm right on where the precipitation starts to drop off. And so you can still see that the north here is getting adequate rainfall, but unfortunately that dry area looks like it's going to expand. And I should also mention, you know, you have Paraguay here in Argentina, Uruguay. Of course, Argentina is another large production area for soybeans and corn, and that's also getting hit pretty hard as well. So what are we looking for in terms of overall production this year? And I'm decided to work off of CONAB's numbers. CONAB is sort of the USDA in Brazil, and they give more of the impartial production estimates. And so they're estimating based off of last month's report, 5.25 billion bushel crop of soybeans in Brazil overall, and that's on an area of 99.7 million acres. Now, I have seen some acreage estimates as high as 101 million acres, and so obviously as time goes on, those numbers can still change. It can be revised upward or downward, similar to the United States. In the corn crop, they're looking for so in the soybean crop, they're looking for a larger crop, another record crop larger than in the United States. And then looking at the corn crop overall, 4.79 billion bushels, you know, still roughly a fourth, maybe a little less than a fourth of the size of the United States crop. And so the U.S. still has a pretty big advantage. However, that Brazilian crop is getting larger at a quicker rate than in the United States. And that's based off of an area of 51.7 million acres. Now I broke it down here. You can see between each crop, there's 3 distinct crops in Brazil. the biggest of which is the second crop, which makes up 3.52 billion bushels. So we haven't even begun planting that crop yet. We're still kind of in the middle stages here of the first crop, which so there's roughly 1.18 billion bushels on an area of 11 million acres. And so that when we talk about the corn that's at risk right now, we're just talking about the first crop in Brazil. We haven't begun the second crop. That'll begin here next month as soon as they begin harvesting soybeans in parts of Mato Grosso and Paraná. The third crop is fairly insignificant yet, very, very small. You know, looking at 76 million bushels is all in an area of 1.45 million acres. You might have guessed that based off these acreage numbers, the yields are actually pretty low compared to the United States, where they're looking for an average yield of around 100 bushels per acre, which pales in comparison to what our 177, 178 bushel per acre numbers that we're estimating in the Corn Belt. But one of the differences is that a lot of the corn isn't, the soybeans are actually the cash crop, and the corn, especially in the case of the second crop, is considered more of a rotational crop. And so it's a shorter season. Sometimes they don't invest in as much into that second crop. And so it's just the fact that it's over such a much larger area that it amounts to a larger volume. And so I'll show you some charts here where we'll see why how those numbers have changed over time. So this is the Brazilian soybean production history. You can see how much that they've grown by basically 5 times in the last 20 years or so. You can see in the last 3 years that the last couple years they've set new records. In the 1920 crop last year at this 137 million metric tons. Now this 144 is what the USDA has estimated for this crop season. And that, of course, is still up in the air. It's still very early, and it's partly why we're seeing a lot of movement in the soybean market today. Looking at the soybean yield history, it's interesting to see how that compares to the United States. You can see that they both have more or less been going up together. So there's been a pretty significant upward trend. However, in the last couple of years, Brazil's overall yield has actually overtaken that of the United States. And so last year was at 52.4. Actually, I think in the last CONAB report, they increased this to 52.5. And if that becomes true, which is still, we're a long ways from that happening, that would be the highest yielding crop in Brazil's history and would beat that of the United States. And so, but you can see the U.S. isn't far behind, but they've kind of been battling, going back and forth in terms of yield. Now this looks over number of acres over the last 20 years and how that's changed. And you can see there is a slight uptick over time in the United States from 74 to 87 million acres, but there's a much more steeper uptrend in Brazil's production. It's increased by 300% in the last 30 years compared to 45% for the United States in the same period. And so, the last CONAB put this number at 99.7, and I said that there are some private estimates that see that surpassing 100, maybe reaching 101 million acres for soybeans. And so we'll probably see that number adjusted higher over time. Overall production, I talked about how Brazil here, beginning in about the 17-18 crop year, that they finally overtook the U.S. crop size, and they've continued to add to that over time. And so the U.S. crop has been getting bigger every year for the last 30 years. It's just that Brazil's has been getting bigger at just a faster rate than the United States have. So you can see the difference here. The U.S. crop is a little over 4.4 billion bushels compared to close to 5.3 billion bushels in Brazil. So breaking it down, looking at the balance sheet for Brazil, you can see last year's beginning stocks is at 7.3 million metric tons. This is all in million metric tons, and using CONAB's numbers. 142 is CONAB's estimate for production. The USDA is at 144. You can see the imports and seed are relatively insignificant. Of course, you have their crushing, their domestic demand at 47. But their main advantage in Brazil is their exports, of course. They're the world's largest soybean exporter. And so every year they've had the ability that whatever is left over, they've been able to max out those exports, and basically any excess that they've had that they aren't going to use domestically, they've been able to ship that out more than not to places like China. And that helps them keep their ending stocks low. That's a couple million more than last year, but still fairly low ending stocks based off of this estimate at 9.3. And so, you know, if they manage to produce a little bit more, you know, all that's really going to happen is you're probably going to see this go from 89.9 to, you know, 91.9 or 92.9. So you'll see a strong boost in exports. Looking on the domestic demand side, well, one of the strong benefits in Brazil is their biodiesel mandate that they've set for the last several years, and kind of see that every year it increases over time. So we're all the way up here already in March of almost in March of 2022, when it's supposed to increase to 14%. They have, however, reduce that to 10% to kind of help reduce inflation, fuel cost inflation, which is going on in Brazil right now, as in the United States and a lot of other places. And so they've temporarily reduced that to 10%, but I think fairly, you know, by next year you'll see this go back up to what it was. So in 2023, it's already expected to go to 15% for their biodiesel mandate. So that's been a big help to domestic demand, that every year they've been able to count on consuming that much more in soybeans every year. So breaking down where the soybean production is produced in Brazil, you can see how while the southern part is the traditional area and a lot of the attention goes to Mato Grosso, the southern part of Brazil here, these bottom three states still make up 32%, still a pretty significant amount of the soybean production. And so, you know, while Mato Grosso is still the largest state, and these states make up the bulk of it, Goiás, Mato Grosso do Sul at 45%, it's still probably not going to be enough to offset the losses that it looks like we're going to begin seeing here in the southern part of Brazil at 32%. It's just too big of an area. And so, you know, as time goes on, you're going to see more growth in the southeast area, kind of where I'm at right now, the Mapitobá, which means Maranhão, Piauí, Tocantins, and Bahia. And then, of course, here in the north. But so yeah, that's essentially the breakdown of where the soybean productions are. Breaking it down by state, Mato Grosso is still the king. 27% of Brazil's total soybean output comes from Mato Grosso, and Rio Grande do Sul, and you know, is a distant second, and that's where the kind of epicenter of the drought is in Brazil right now. And then it's starting to really hurt places of Paraná as well. And so you can see Paraná is also a significant producer. Last year, I think Paraná was actually in second place just because Rio Grande do Sul had a bad year. And so that may still happen this year again. And so you kind of see Rio Grande do Sul and Paraná battling for that second place in terms of soybean production. Just taking a quick look at what soybean exports and how they've shifted over, the market share shifted from the U.S. to Brazil. You can see in the 90s, the U.S. had 68% of the soybean exports, and Brazil today has 50%, you know, from this 2016 to 2020 level. So it's dropped from 68% in the U.S. now to 35% in the last 5 years or so. And so their share of the soybean exports is dwindled in the United States, and it's been shifting to Brazil. So Brazil in the 90s was at 14%, and that's increased to 50%. And of course, most of those soybean purchases are all going to Brazil, or excuse me, most of it is going to China, 73%. So it's a pretty big shift in the last 30 years. This is graph's a little bit outdated, but I like kind of the visual that it shows you where are all these soybean exports going. And so you can see the three main competitors. You have the U.S., Brazil, and then Argentina is kind of in a distant third place. But of course, most of the grain is going to Asia, especially China. So you can kind of see, where the movement flows. There's a little bit going to Europe and Mexico, but most of it is going to China. And so that's the flow of the soybean exports around the world. One interesting thing, I took this picture driving down the road in the center of Mato Grosso, and it's kind of interesting that you see these Chinese symbols. And so COFCO is the Chinese grain trading company, and you wouldn't really see this in the United States, but you see it more and more in some of the major grain producing regions. Just driving down the roads, you'd see Chinese symbols, and essentially the Chinese are not even going through middlemen. They're just setting up their own facilities and grain ports in Mato Grosso and different places, and just buying the soybeans directly from the farmers and then shipping it right out of Brazil to their country to help secure their food supply. So it's just kind of different that you don't see any big Chinese symbols driving through on a lot of the grain facilities when you drive through the Corn Belt. This is the crop season where we're at right now. So we're in the month of December. So we're right in the heart of the planting season here. We're finishing up in soybeans and corn, and we get into January. We'll be in the growing period for the first crop of corn, and then we'll start the harvest for the soybeans in parts of Brazil, in Mato Grosso, western Paraná, where they usually plant pretty early, and then they'll start planting right following that with the second crop of corn. So there'll be a lot of activity. January is probably the busiest time of the year for a lot of the Brazilian farmers in Mato Grosso. So let's shift and talk about corn. Last year, where the estimate for the corn crop originally was at 110. I should have updated that. So they actually came in at 86 million metric tons. And so this is originally what they were estimating, and they came in at 86. And that was based on 46 million acres. So this year, CONAB is estimating 116.7 million metric tons. And so a pretty big boost from what they originally estimated, and especially since what they ended up being at 86 to 116. And you can see here they're adding almost 6 million acres of corn. And that's just kind of following in lockstep with the soybean area. As the soybean area expands, so does the corn area. Of course, last season drought had a lot to do with the lower production in both beans and corn, which brought down the lower ending stocks as well. Brazil is every year becoming a stronger exporter on the global market as well, and that's just a trend that's been happening the last 15 years or so. It wasn't that long ago when they were a net importer of corn, and now they're building a stronger market for their export products. Meat demand has grown a lot in Brazil. Of course, that creates a huge market for consumption of their corn. It was just announced here late last week that China is back in the market and has, dropped that suspension of Brazilian beef exports. And so China right now makes up 50% of Brazil's beef exports. And so that was a huge market that they had lost for about 3.5 months. But they just came back now and announced that they're back buying Brazilian beef again. The other thing that you'll see changing, continue to change, is corn ethanol. That's becoming more popular and growing a lot in Brazil, especially in the center west region. And as I mentioned, that as we grow more soybean acres, that all that means is you're going to add more corn acres behind it as well. This gives you the breakdown of total corn area in Brazil. You can see here that it's over more than doubled, about 250% increase in the last 20 years. And you can see that the yield here, that's in kilos per hectare. Most of this is in hectares here, has increased as well. One thing I would note here is that the total land area hasn't increased quite as much. Most of that increase I'll show you here is coming from the second crop. You can kind of see how the overall trend obviously is up. Last year at this 86 million metric tons where they got hit by the drought, but this is 118 is what the USDA is estimating for next year. Mato Grosso's place is solidified even more in corn, where they represent 34% of Brazil's overall corn output. And again, most of that is coming from the second crop. You basically need the next 3 states combined to match what Mato Grosso is producing. These states are still doing okay for the time being in their first crop, but Paraná, most of this is going to come from the second crop production for corn. And so it looks like the first crop corn is going to take a little bit of a hit here, especially in the south and Rio Grande do Sul. But most of the crop is still yet to come, and so I wouldn't say that it's going to be a huge drop yet. But it looks like it's losing its luster a little bit, let's say, on the first crop so far. So you can see here how much in all these other states that they're relatively small, somewhat insignificant in terms of production, and so it really. That's why Mato Grosso gets all the attention, just because of how big it is compared to the other states. I like this chart because it shows you in the green here is the production for first crop corn compared to the dark blue here in second crop production, and then this orange here in the third crop. And you can see here that the first crop really hasn't, if anything, it's gotten a little bit smaller over the years. And it's kind of topped out at this 40 million metric tons level. I think last year actually ended up closer to 23 million metric tons. And they're estimating, closer to 30, 32 million metric tons for this year. And so the first crop has actually gotten smaller, while the second crop, obviously, you can see here, has gotten much bigger. And so that's where most of your growth in the overall corn production has come from. And we haven't even begun planting that yet in Brazil. And so, it's way too early, of course, then to say, oh, there's been a major crop damage in Brazil's crop, because they really haven't planted the bulk of it yet. And then, of course, you have your third crop, which is still fairly insignificant, but they're beginning to track that as well. You can kind of see here where the first season corn production breakdown is. Rio Grande do Sul is the biggest state for first crop corn production at 20%. Second largest state is actually where I'm at, in Minas Gerais. And in Minas Gerais, the first corn crop looks great so far. So here in the south, where you have 40% of the first corn crop, that's where most of the damage is taking place right now. And so now when you shift to the second crop, you can kind of see where it moves to the center west region further north. So you can kind of see there, here's first crop, here's second, here's first, here's second. So you can kind of see here how big a difference that Mato Grosso makes in the breakdown of that corn production. Looking at the ending stocks in Brazil's ending stocks for Brazil in corn, you kind of see here that they've been shifting lower the last several years. This season at 7.5 million metric tons, and so that's part of the reason why they're seeing is record prices in local currency right now. However, they are expecting a bigger boost here, assuming they get the production that they're estimating at this 12.4 And so looking at taking that 7.5 million metric tons from last year, using CONAB's production estimate of 116, and then subtracting imports, which are relatively insignificant, and then consumption levels at 76 million metric tons. And this again is the biggest outlier, the exports at 36 million metric tons. Now last year, of course, which is just finishing now, they had originally estimated closer to 35 million metric tons, but with the drought, it's going to be just under 20 million metric tons. So of course it depends yet on how well they're going to produce, but if they do have excess corn, you know, they can just export more of that out. But based off these numbers, that gets you 12.4 million metric ton ending stocks, which not the highest that they've had, but a pretty good boost from wherever they were at last year at this time. And this gives you a historical view of what they've done in terms of exports. So this is where we're estimating for this year right now, about 20 million metric tons. So not the lowest that they've had, but quite a bit lower than where they've been at the last couple of years. You can see they're at 40 million metric tons. It's half of what they exported in 2018. And so for this year, they'd be back closer to the second highest corn exports if that were to come at 36 million metric tons, if that were to take place. One thing that kind of has caught my attention that I don't think is on people's radar quite as much yet, and probably should be, is that in addition to the soybeans, corn, Brazil's ethanol exports are actually expanding dramatically. And so here you can see the U.S. production, or excuse me, U.S. ethanol exports. And you know, prior to COVID, it's no secret that the U.S. ethanol industry was having a tough time. They had very slim margins, but one of the bright spots was exports. You can see here, you know, from 2013, every year they were increasing dramatically their ethanol exports. Now in the last couple of years, it's started to drop. And what's changed? Brazil has made a major push to begin exporting their ethanol. And while it's still much less than what it is in the United States, it's growing at a much faster pace, somewhat at the expense of U.S. exports. And so this is where we're at for 2020. And I think, you know, there's still a pretty healthy gap, but I think in the next couple of years, we're going to see this gap close. And so Brazil is becoming very competitive with ethanol exports. A lot of that, I think, has to do with this company here. This company is FS Bioenergia. This is actually the first large scale pure corn ethanol plant in Brazil. It's located right in the heart of Mato Grosso. I think this plant was first built in 2016. Since then, they built a second plant and are actually in the process right now of building their third, and they're still not done yet. Each of these plants can produce 100 to 150 million gallons. I think their overall goal is to get to 1.3 billion gallons of U.S. ethanol. And so they're basically located in one of the highest concentration of corn production in the entire country. And at least up until a couple of years ago, had some of the cheapest corn in the country. And buying that and converting it to ethanol. I think you'll continue to see this trend continue over the next several years. There's several other plants that are in various stages of construction and production. And there's also a lot of plants, sugarcane plants, that can be converted to flex plants, meaning sugarcane is just a seasonal process that runs 6 months out of the year. So they can still process sugarcane for 6 months, and if they make an investment into a flex plant, then they can convert corn ethanol for the other 6 months. And the advantage obviously being that they aren't shut down for half of the year, as they have been historically. And so you can see here how we based off of this one estimate that they're looking at the corn ethanol production quadrupling in by 2028 in Brazil. And then this is how much corn consumption is being consumed right now in Brazil. You know, still relatively small, but the fact that it's increased by 280% in the last 4 years alone, and I think will continue to increase at that rate. So it's increasing exponentially in Brazil right now. One of the differences in Brazil corn ethanol processing is that in the U.S. the plants all run off of natural gas. Well, they don't have natural gas in these areas in Brazil, and so the plants are all fueled by eucalyptus wood chips. And so this is another thing you see are these forests planted. This is a planted eucalyptus forest in Mato Grosso, and it's right in the middle of the corn and soybean areas. And that these trees are now basically sold to a lot of these ethanol plants that use it to fuel those plants. They're chopped up into wood chips and then used to power the ethanol plants. You know, there are a few advantages that sugarcane has. They're energy self-sufficient, meaning that the residue from the sugarcane, which is called bagasse, is used to power the plants, and so they have to buy very little electricity or natural gas, things like that, to run the plant. They can also switch back and forth between their two main products, either ethanol or sugar. So if ethanol prices drop, they can switch and produce sugar, or if sugar prices drop, they can switch and produce ethanol. Where with corn ethanol, yes, you do have the byproducts, but you just have the ethanol as the one main product. There are some major disadvantages of the sugarcane, though, is that it's so yeah, I was talking about the disadvantages of sugarcane in Brazil, and you know, how a lot of the land that the sugarcanes have to either buy or rent around them, and so that makes it much more expensive, of course, for their operation. And imagine if in the Midwest, if all the ethanol plants had to either buy or rent a lot of the land around them just to secure their inventory, corn inventory. You know, so it'd be a much different scenario. The other big disadvantage is that sugarcane has to be processed within 3 days of being harvested. And so that's the reason for that. They need to secure their supply. It's not something that can be stored. And so unlike corn, where you can buy it and store it for a year or more without really losing any quality at all. So that's why I think corn ethanol has a pretty good future compared to sugarcane ethanol in Brazil. Just want to talk briefly about the exchange rate and the impact that it's had on the prices in Brazil. Of course, it's not something that the U.S. farmers have to worry about too often. The Brazilians, of course, have the risk of the exchange rate, and you can see here that over the course of the last several years before COVID, it was kind of bumping up close to that 4 reals per dollar, and then it just kind of really took off and weakened here dramatically once COVID began and a lot of businesses started to shut down. And that's actually been a good thing really for the agriculture industry, for farmers, not necessarily for the economy as a whole, but it's been good for farmers because it makes their exports cheaper to foreign buyers, and B, they're getting more in local currency. And so before they were getting 4 Brazilian reals per dollar, now they're getting 6 or 5 to 6 Brazilian reals per dollar. And right now it's hovering around this 5.6 level. And so, it's kind of fallen into a trading range there. But so it's something that they need to consider. Of course, a lot of their inputs are still dollarized, and so they have that risk. Their costs can be dollarized. Their soybeans are dollarized as well. Kind of works as a natural hedge to offset some of that risk. Just before I ended up here, shifting here, want to talk a little bit about the transportation of Brazil, where the flow of a lot of the grain is moving out of. Now this is a little bit old, this graph, but you can still see a lot of the soybeans are being shifted from Mato Grosso flowing to the main port in Santos. This is by far the largest port in Brazil, and so you still find a lot of the soybeans are being shipped out of there. This other port here, Paranaguá, is also fairly large, probably the second largest. But one thing that you're seeing a shift is that a lot of these port infrastructure in the Amazon has improved and increased quite a bit. And so I think close to roughly 30% or more now of the grain in Mato Grosso is now being exported out through these Amazon ports in Santarém, Manaus, different areas like that. And so, 10 years ago, it was almost zero. And so that's been a big shift here, and it's alleviated a lot of the pressure on these ports. And of course, it's cheapened up their trucking costs as well. This is an image is a couple years old, but this was kind of a significant point in history, I thought, for Brazilian agriculture. This is the Brazilian Army Corps of Engineers basically celebrating because they finished asphalting the road to the port in the Amazon. And this is 2 years old already. And so think about that for a moment. I mean, that'd be like if the United States finally built an asphalted road to like the port in the Gulf or something like that. Up until that time, it was all dirt roads like what you're seeing on the left here. And so it was a big deal for them. I'm sure they won't stop there. I'm sure over time they'll look to add more, but they finally got their first asphalted road out to the port in Amazon just a couple of years ago. And again, this kind of shows you where a lot of that grain is moving. We've seen a lot of improvements in infrastructure, especially in the ports. People always ask me, what improvements have we seen in infrastructure in Brazil? And in terms of railways and roads, really not all that much overall. They've maybe resurfaced some roads that had a lot of potholes, but most of the improvements that you're seeing are in the port infrastructure. That's where a lot of the investments are coming from, and that's kind of cheapened up their freight costs, which in turn improves their prices at the farm gate. And just a couple of slides here about how the lack of railroad, I should say, in Brazil compares to that in the United States. There's a tremendous amount of difference, and they just have a difficult time developing those more railroads into the frontier areas where all the growth is. They're all highly concentrated in the southern part of Brazil. This also gives you kind of an idea what the railroad density is like in Brazil. I want to talk briefly about the environmental situation in Brazil. Of course, we hear a lot of news about Brazil tearing down the Amazon, and I think there is some of that going on for sure. I would point out that Brazil is a big place, and it's not all the Amazon jungle. You can see here this kind of dark blue area is where most of the growth in the last 20 years in Brazil has actually come from. I'm located right here. I farmed here in this area, and so we're still quite a ways away from the Amazon. So that's where most of that growth has come from, and it's considered the Cerrado biome. It's not even the Amazon biome. The difference is that now they're kind of encroaching on the Amazon biome, and of course that's a lot of concern for a lot of people. I still think by and all, most farmers follow the forest code, but there's still a lot of bad apples that I think are violating some of that forest code, and Brazil is having a hard time enforcing that, and so they need to do a better job enforcing this area. Now the problem with that is this Amazon biome area is the size of Europe. Now imagine Europe with really no roads, no Wi-Fi, no cell phone. How do you enforce an area like that? It's extremely remote. There are people that are willing to go out and kind of strike a claim on their own, live in these remote areas just so they can claim a piece of land and clear it. And so it's hard you don't want to build a road for the police, to help facilitate things, because that'll just facilitate the other people coming in and facilitate the development of that region. So ironically, I mean, they're able to track a lot of the clearing by satellite. Brazil actually has the technology to do that. They just lack the resources to enforce this on the ground, and it's just because it's such a huge area. And so I point that out, that a lot of the growth, is really not come from the Amazon. A lot of it's come from the Cerrado here in the last 20 years, but it's still a risk to the Amazon, and they need to do a better job enforcing that. Now, Brazilians would point out that almost 2/3 of their entire country is in some sort of native protected area. And so they do get a little bit upset when people want to say, hey, you need to be doing more to protect your forest, when a lot of other countries, and we could take US as an example, only roughly 20% of the US is in some sort of protected area. Only 1/3 of what Brazil's is. And so I guess they would probably argue it seems a little bit hypocritical that when their protected area is 3 times larger than countries like the United States, and much larger than other countries. I just use the U.S. as an example, that they would argue they're doing more, than what other countries have done. It's just they're more under the magnifying glass right now. Pasture actually makes up a huge area in Brazil. There's close to 230 million head of cattle, and that's where a lot of your growth is going to come from. Is a lot of the pasture right now is going to be converted to grain production, and the actual agricultural row crop production area only makes about 8% of the land use in Brazil. So we did take a tour right before COVID began. This was taken in January of 2020. We took about 15 Americans down to Brazil and went to a family farm here in Minas Gerais, went to Mato Grosso, went to Rio de Janeiro, and so went to the Christ statue. And so it was kind of interesting. But the one theme that we got from a lot of Brazilian producers is that they're becoming more bold, and they see themselves as becoming the new world food supplier, and kind of pushing ahead over the United States. And so, the trend is heading in that direction, and I think the U.S. will always still have a very strong place in global production, but Brazil is obviously growing each year in that regard. It's not all perfect in Brazil, of course. I think that there's a lot of political and economic issues in Brazil, challenges that they face. In some ways, they're almost like a mini United States in terms of they have a lot of legislative bottlenecks in their Congress, between their respective political parties. There's been a lot of divisiveness over comments made by the president, saying that if he were to lose the re-election, that he would not leave the office. And so, and they're also going through kind of the same situation with COVID, where they've had roughly 600,000 deaths. And so they've been struggling with how to manage COVID, I think, as they have in the United States as well. Now, the economy in Brazil has not rebounded as well as it has in the United States. They, like the United States, they spent a lot of money on stimulus payments. However, they've pretty much spent their wad and everything that they had, and they've run out of money basically, and there's no more money to be spent for stimulus payments and help like that. And so it's put the debt through COVID has increased dramatically. Inflation has increased. It's still, as far as comparing it to other developing countries, it's still within range, but it's higher compared to where the United States is at. And they've been raising interest rates at a very quick, much faster pace than they have in the United States. I think it's just under 8% right now, but they'll probably continue to increase that here in the next couple of years. And so I think you'll see it back to somewhere between 10 and 12% later in 2022. Of course, there's a lot of environmental pushback that I talked about in the Amazon. Southern Brazil is dry right now. And of course, the lack of infrastructure and bureaucracy are things that they can't seem to get much done in terms of improvement there. The U.S. still has tremendous advantages in its financial lending system. We're still much more liquid than they are in Brazil. We have much lower interest rates. Our cost of doing business is cheaper. You know, we don't, obviously the US dollar can have an impact on our exports, but it doesn't have a direct impact, currency risk to each individual farmer like it does in Brazil. And you know, we're fortunate that we have a solid and functional crop insurance industry, subsidized, but they don't have that in Brazil. And you know, so that's a big benefit that we have. And then, of course, just some of the risk management tools I think are important that we have in the United States that they also are slowly starting to develop in Brazil, but it's not as widely adopted yet and as functional in Brazil as it is in the United States. So, so finishing up here, I kind of talked for a while. So if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to type those now. We do offer a lot of information on Brazil. You know, bits and pieces during the week, but usually on midweek on Wednesdays, we offer quite a bit of information on Brazil. And so if you're interested, you can sign up at comstock.com for our report, and you can get more weekly information on what's going on in Brazil and the crops. And so we'll see. Sorry that I think I lost a lot of viewers with the internet going down here, but that's just how things work sometimes in Brazil. But we gotta adapt to that. So I think that's all I have for you. Thank you for joining us, and feel free to give us a call at 712-227-1110. Thank you.